Welcome back to the Bookly podcast. This week's episode of the podcast is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. And it's been a couple weeks since I've read this book. I finished it, I think about 2 weeks ago, in preparation for an episode that I was supposed to do with my mom. However, she didn't finish the book and while she was visiting. So we ended up having to skip that episode, skip recording this episode, and it's been just a couple weeks since I have read it. And I've gone back and I've looked over, plot summaries and highlights and things like that and done my research. So I feel like I'm back in the mindset of the book, but it may take me a couple seconds to remember things throughout this episode because there's just a little bit of a lag. I usually like to record episodes almost immediately after finishing the book, so within a day or two. Just keeps the book pretty fresh on my mind. It's hard for me to remember things. I'm just kind of a dumb guy. and I think that that's true for most people. Most people can remember major things, but remembering all the intricacies and names and places and timelines and things like that can be difficult, especially when you're trying to stay consistent, read on a regular schedule. And when reading is still, I feel like, a learned skill for me. I'm still learning the skill of reading right now. I am still newer to this whole process, I will admit. So I'm just not to the point where I can retain as much as I would have liked to, which is another reason why I love doing this podcast, which is because I feel like talking about the books and everything just helps kind of solidify it in my brain. And so reading a book without talking about it now, it's to the point where it's just right over my head. So hopefully this episode will not be like that. And for anybody who's wondering why we're out of whack with our schedule, the book that was supposed to be released next week, I believe on the 28th or something like that, was the new Jack Carr book, something blood. I can't remember. But that book got pushed back for its release date. I believe it's being released now in July or August. And so because of the pushback on the release date, we weren't obviously able to read it. And so we are kind of moving things around. And I had planned on recording this episode early anyway, because again, my mom was supposed to have read this book with me. She was coming to visit for my brother's graduation. And so this book is kind of being moved up in the list. This was a book that was supposed to be released in September. So we're just switching this book and the Jack Carr book. And then we're pushing Pride and Prejudice back 1 week because I have a work trip. Again, I have a million excuses. I have a work trip coming up. I wasn't able to finish Pride and Prejudice. I'm about halfway through. And so because of that, we're just bumping this book to this week, Pride and Prejudice next week. And then I think the week after that is going to be Mistborn Now. And we will just skip right over the Jack Carr book. And that one will fill the place of where East of Eden is in our reading list. So if you're wondering about how to read along with the Bookly podcast, that's going to be our schedule. Again, you can go and see our schedule on our Instagram post, or if you are on YouTube, it's in the community section of our Instagram page, or not our Instagram, our YouTube page. And so you can check out what books we're going to be reading throughout the year. It's posted through the end of this year, through December. So we have a big list of books that we've got chosen for the podcast, and this is one of the bigger ones. East of Eden was long. I was not expecting it to be this long. Again, I chose books purely based off of what people recommended to me, what the internet said I should read. I Googled about a bajillion lists of 100 books that you should read before you die, and I chose a significant amount of the books off of that list for my first year of reading, especially because I just, essentially had read nothing coming into this podcast. I was the most illiterate human being that there was. And so because of that, a lot of the books that I've chosen are classics or whatnot. And I had heard of them, but I knew, other than the name and maybe the name of the author, I had heard of John Steinbeck before, I knew nothing about this book going into it. So one, I had no idea how long it was. It is a long book. So for anybody who struggles with long books, this is a longer book. Not that it's bad. I want to preface that. I am not of the opinion that all long books are bad. My wife is a little bit like that. She struggles with long books. She actually loved this book though. She gave it 5 out of 5. And so there are some long books that she will like, but she definitely goes into long books already kind of with like a chip on their shoulder, if that makes sense. A long book has something to prove in the eyes of my wife, I think, because, a lot of times a long book just means that it wasn't edited, and it just drags and it drags. And it's hard to do a long book really well. I've kind of found that with a couple of the other longer books that we've read on the podcast. I mean, the first one that comes to my mind is, what was that dumb book? Oh my gosh. I hated it. It was, it wasn't The Coddling of the American Mind, but it was, I can't remember. It was one of those other nonfiction books that we read that I just absolutely hated. And it was because it was too long and it needed to be edited down. And so, there's a reason that there are editors in place. And so, that was a little bit of a tangent, but yes, this book is long. I knew nothing about it. I was on a walk right before I started reading this book with my wife, and we were just talking about books, and she was like, yeah, I mean, this is, it should be interesting. She had read it previously one other time, and she was rereading it with me. And she was like, oh yeah, it's, an allegory for the story of Cain and Abel. And I was like, really? It is. She's like, dude, the name is East of Eden. Like, Eden is in the title. She's like, do you know nothing about literature? And I was like, honestly, I didn't. I knew nothing. I knew nothing about what this book was going to be about. She could have told me on that walk that this book was about dinosaurs, and I would have been like, really? John Steinbeck wrote about dinosaurs. That's pretty lit. That's as much as I knew about this book going into it. So I was pleasantly surprised. I actually really, really enjoyed this book a lot more than I thought. And I think that's the consensus around the internet and around kind of everybody. Everybody seems to love this book. Now, there are some people who don't, just with everything. There are always going to be naysayers and haters out there who don't like things. But for the vast majority of people, I would say that this book is like very well regarded. On Goodreads, this book has a 4.41 on Goodreads with over 500,000 reviews, which is insane for Goodreads. Anybody who knows Goodreads knows that like classics kind of hover around 4. Like if it's above 4, like 4.1 or 4.01 or whatever it is, then it usually means it's like a good classic for me. And then if it's under 4, means it might end up being like a little bit rough. You might get like a 3.8 or something. But usually that's kind of the spectrum for classics. I feel like they fall within like 3.75 to 4.25. So just for perspective, that's like the average classic score on Goodreads that I've seen. Again, this is my very limited research. But this book has a 4.4, which is insane. Like 4.4s are like on Goodreads, those are saved for Hunger Games and Harry Potter. Like those are those kinds of numbers. And this is a classic and a dense classic, a long, dense classic. And so, I mean, that just goes to show how important this book was. And even John Steinbeck himself said that this is kind of like his magnum opus. This is his book. And John Steinbeck is, he's a pretty, I don't know if you know this, but he's kind of a big deal. But he actually, and I was going to come back to a little bit about his bio. He won a Pulitzer Prize, not for this book, but for Grapes of Wrath. And we've talked about Pulitzer Prizes on this podcast. They're most of the Pulitzer Prize winning books that we've read outside of The Road, which was terrible, we've really enjoyed. I've really enjoyed a lot of the Pulitzer Prize books. I tend to agree with a lot of the Pulitzer Prize categories outside of, obviously, The Road, which was terrible. But John Steinbeck not only won a Pulitzer Prize, but he won a Nobel Prize, which I didn't know that was on the table. You know what I mean? Like when you're handing out prizes, you're like, yeah, this author's got a Nobel Prize. This author's got a Pulitzer Prize. This author has a Pulitzer Prize. Yeah, a Nobel Prize winning author is, I think at that point you can kind of say like, I'm kind of a big deal. And so that's John Steinbeck. He is the American author of kind of the mid 19th century or 20th century. I never understand what 20th century and 19th century is, because in my opinion, 19th century should be the 1900s, but I'm pretty sure the 19th century is actually the 1800s, and then the 20th century, because I'm pretty sure we're in the 21st century. I don't know. Or the 18th. I don't know where it goes, but the 1900s. American author of the 1900s. I mean, John Steinbeck is like at the top of that list, or near the top of that list. So he's definitely a big deal. And he says about, when talking about East of Eden, he says, this book will be the most difficult of all I've ever attempted. I think perhaps it is the only book I have ever written. I think that there is only one book to a man. So basically what he's saying here is that, all of the other books that he had written up to this process, which included Grapes of Wrath, which won a Pulitzer Prize, was basically just practice. It was everything that got him to the point of writing this book. Like, this was everything to him, which is, I want to say, one of the reasons why I chose this book, but it isn't. And the reason why I chose this book is because it was on some dumb list about 100 books that you should read before you die. But ultimately, I'm glad that I read this book because it gave me a glimpse into a lot about, Steinbeck's writing style and kind of the things that I did like and the things that I didn't like about him, but maybe the things that I can look past because of kind of the greatness of the way that he writes. And so I definitely want to go back and read, Grapes of Wrath, of Mice and Men, and I think there was one more that I really wanted to read. I mean, ultimately he's written like 33 books, so he's written a ton of stuff. Some of those are short stories, some of them are, I think he co-authored a book with one person, but ultimately I think his count is 33, and there are a handful that I definitely want to go back and reread, mostly because of how much I enjoyed this book. So for those of you who fall into the same category as myself, who had no idea sorry, I want to say Grapes of Wrath now, but no idea what East of Eden is even about, let me read the summary of this book because I honestly could not have told you what this was going to be about before I read it. So in his journal, Nobel Prize winner John Steinbeck called East of Eden the first book. And indeed, it has the primordial power and simplicity of myth. Set in rich farmland of California's Salinas Valley, this sprawling and often brutal novel follows the intertwined destinies of two families, the Trasks and the Hamiltons, whose generations helplessly reenact the fall of Adam and Eve and the poisonous rivalry of Cain and Abel. Adam Trask came to California from the east to farm and raise a family on new rich land. But the birth of his twins, Cal and Aaron, bring his wife to the brink of madness, and Adam is left alone to raise his boys to manhood. One of the boys thrives, nurtured by love of all of those around him. The other grows up in loneliness, enveloped by a mysterious darkness. First published in 1952, East of Eden is the work in which Steinbeck created his most mesmerizing characters and explored his most enduring themes. The mystery of identity, the inexplicability of love, inexplicability, I don't know what that means, and the murderous consequences of love's absence. A masterpiece of Steinbeck's later years, East of Eden is a powerful and vastly ambitious novel that is at once a family saga and a modern retelling of the book of Genesis. So I felt like that description does pretty well to describe it, outside of the fact that it says real quickly there that this brings his wife to the brink of madness. No, Kathy is the absolute devil, and that is a terrible description of who she is. She is Satan reincarnate, and she is one of the most evil characters that I have ever read or seen in a book. I know that we made a video on YouTube a little while ago about like the second greatest villain in books that I've read. And I know that like number one, I've got Big Brother from 1985. I think is still one of my favorite villains and kind of all time. And then we had two, which was the new one from a book that we read this year, which was Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, who is phenomenal. Again, if you have not read No Country for Old Men and you are put off by Cormac McCarthy because of The Road, which is terrible, I think that's the third time I've said that on this episode of the podcast. I hated that book. Then just read No Country for Old Men because it is good and it's way better than The Road. But Anton Chigurh in that book is amazing. He was, in my opinion, the second greatest book villain of all time. And I don't know if Kathy is going to replace him She might. It's pretty close. I mean, it's pretty close between the two of them. She is just the worst. The worst. I mean, just evil to her core, terrible person. And so, I mean, yeah, that's the only thing I would have changed from the description of this book. That was his wife to the brink of madness. I mean, no, not the brink of madness. His wife is Satan, and Aaron is left alone to raise the boys to manhood. That's how that description should have gone. But yeah, so overall, I will say, really enjoyed this book. It is a bit wordy. So for those of you who maybe struggle in very descriptive books, I think from what I understand, from my very limited knowledge, John Steinbeck kind of wrote a journal while writing this book, or either wrote a journal alongside this book that talks about this book or his experiences writing. I don't know how they're exactly connected, but ultimately there's a journal and there's this book. And he talks a lot about East of Eden in this journal. And he even says that, if you struggle with any sort of kind of like overly descriptive narratives, then you can skip essentially like the first chapter of this book. And there are large portions of this book that you can just skip right over, because he does spend a significant amount of time basically just talking about how beautiful the land is, talking about how, I don't even know what people look like, talking about war, talking about the time, talking about what people like to do. I don't know. He's incredibly descriptive. And I was reading reviews about, what people liked and didn't like about the book. There are a lot of people that don't like that about the book. They don't like how slow it is. However, there was one review that kind of struck me about the book that after reading it, I was kind of like, you know what? I agree with that. I think that that's how I feel. And a lot of times I have a really hard time articulating why I like and don't like books until I go and read the reviews. And then people who are much more articulate than myself kind of point out points. And I'm like, oh yeah, you know what? That's right. That's how I feel. And that's exactly what happened here. So they were saying that there are significant like slower sections of the book that are very descriptive and they're very beautiful, and the writing is amazing. And my sister even said at one point, she's like, I wish people nowadays talked like that, that they took the time to really kind of articulate how they feel in a ways that, weren't like, yeet, skirt, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just like small sound bites and clips and, 15-second reels and things like that. But Steinbeck really took the time to bring you into his story. And it's a slow process to do that. I mean, he really does try to slowly paint the picture around it. However, what I heard from this review is that, like, what you have to appreciate is the slow way in which kind of the land moves around them, and the slow way in which Steinbeck kind of describes kind of what's going on around them, mixed in with the fact that the plot moves pretty quickly if you take all of that stuff out. So it's almost like a contrast between two stories. It's like a very slow love story of the Salinas Valley where he grew up, where Steinbeck grew up, and the time and the land and everything like that mixed in with this kind of fast-paced story. And you can kind of feel which way Steinbeck is writing based on the pace at which he's writing. So just know that going in, like, know that it isn't going to be bang, 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 fast, fast, fast the entire book, but rather, there are slower, more kind of, I would call them more artistic sections of the book. And then there are more plot-driven, kind of like heavier dialogue sections of the book. And they come and go as Steinbeck wants. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like chapter 1 is slow, chapter 2 is fast, chapter 3 is slow, chapter 4 is fast. He just kind of mixes those two writing styles in throughout his entire book. And at first I found that slightly infuriating. I felt like, especially listening to the book on, an audiobook, I felt like there were sections where I was like kind of, in and out of paying attention. And then all of a sudden I was like, crap, I missed something. So then I'd have to go back, listen to it again. And then I'd be listening really intently and then be like, nothing's going on. So then I'd, be doing other things. I'd be like, crap, I missed something. And then I'd have to go back again. until I realized, you know what, I'm just going to put everything away and I'm just going to listen to this book. And then that's when, because there are some books that I can listen to while doing things, and there are some books that I can't. This is one that I decided not to. I decided to just sit there and listen to and enjoy this book. And when I did that, that's when this book became much more fun. It became a very different experience because, again, I could appreciate the slow portions of it but I would also not miss the little kind of faster moving plot-driven points of the book that happened in the middle of these slow parts. And that, I think, to me, made this book significantly more enjoyable. So if you can kind of digest the book like that, I feel like it would be a little bit more, you can kind of get a little bit more out of the book, because I think that was the major turn-off points from people who didn't like the book. They were just like, too slow, DNF, didn't get it. I hated the first chapter. And that was basically everybody. They were like, nope. So if you can kind of break it out like that's what I would say. But overall, I mean, I really, really enjoyed the book. I thought it was beautiful. It was just written amazing. I think the overall kind of messaging of the book was great. I think the use of kind of a very familiar Old Testament story as kind of I don't know what to say, like a rough outline of your book, kind of mixing that in with your own story was really cool. It was a way for me to feel connected to the story already right off from the get-go. But at the same time, it was also a way to bring in new aspects and new kind of, what would you call those? New insights into kind of a very familiar story, the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and the story of Genesis. This book, I felt like almost elaborated on that story through what was added, but at the same time felt familiar throughout the entire process. Thought that was really neat. I did want to read a little bit about his overall, and when I say his, I mean John Steinbeck's overall views on this book, because he wrote a lot about East of Eden. Again, I don't know what these journals, if they coincide specifically with this book or they just coincide with all of his books, and this is his section about East of Eden. But he was asked kind of a little bit to elaborate, or maybe he wasn't asked. Maybe it was just a journal entry. I don't know. I should have probably paid more attention to that. But eventually it came up in his journal, like why he was writing East of Eden. And this is what he said, and I want to read it just verbatim because I think that it's really neat and gives, again, a good insight into kind of his perspective on the book. And he says, I am choosing to write this book to my sons. They are little boys now, and they will never know what they are little boys now, and they will never know what they came from through me unless I tell them. This is not written for them to read now, but when they are grown and the pains and joys have tussled with them a little. And if the book is addressed to them, it is for a good reason. I want them to know how it was. I want them to tell them directly, and perhaps by speaking directly to them, I shall speak directly to other people as well. One can go off into fancynesses. Well, man, I am terrible at reading out loud. I thought I did so good earlier. One can go off into fanciness if one writes into a huge nebulous group, but I think it will be necessary to speak very straight and very clearly and simply if I address my book to two little boys who will be men before they read this book. They have no background in the world of literature. They don't know the great stories of the world as we do. And so I will tell them one of the greatest and perhaps I will tell them one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest story of all time, the story of good and evil, of strength and weakness, of love and hate, of beauty and ugliness. I shall try to demonstrate to them how these doubles are inseparable, how neither can exist without the other, and how out of their groupings creativeness is born. I shall tell them the story against the background of the country I grew up in and along the river I know and do not love very much. I hope that was better listening to it than it was reading it, because that was terrible. I want to highlight one more part. So this is, again, he says, I want to tell them one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest story of all time, the story of good and evil, of strength and weakness, of love and hate, of beauty and ugliness. So again, that was his purpose behind writing this book. He wanted to create kind of the story of all stories for his sons. And I think that that's really neat. And that also goes to kind of show a lot of the reason why this book is so long, the themes, the very intricate descriptions of the land. Again, he wants to tell it against the backdrop of kind of where he grew up. I mean, he went to high school in the Salinas Valley. This is where he's, very familiar with. He, spent a lot of time there, returned back to kind of this Central California area later on in life during the Depression. And so I think that kind of understanding that gives, again, a little bit more perspective into what this book is, because the second probably most critiqued thing on reviews was that this book is a little bit over pretentious. That Steinbeck went into this book trying to write an all-time classic, and that it comes off like that. Like he's just almost pandering, trying to write something like that. And he states right here in his kind of his purpose and description is that he is trying to write almost an all-time classic, well worth reading novel that covers the greatest story of all time, as he says. And so obviously this book is going to be written in a way that tackles and really tries to pull these themes out of the story, because that's the purpose of why he wrote it. And what's wrong with writing a story like that? That's my other thing is, somebody on the comments was like, pretentious, blah, 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 couldn't get into it. He was just trying to create a classic. And what's wrong with picking a very weighty, heavy topic and trying to tackle it in a way that kind of makes it digestible, relatable, that maybe allows people to learn and grow from that topic? I mean, what was he supposed to pick? I don't know. Like, what do you want? Do you want a classic or do you not? Do you want to write a book that nobody ever reads again? I think going into a book trying to write a great book is not a bad thing. The fact that somebody's like, he wrote a book and he was trying to write a great book, and I can tell he was trying to write a great book because this is a great book and it just sounds like a great book, is so dumb. What is he supposed to be like? All right, I want to write a terrible book. In the back of my mind, I kind of hope people will eventually read it, but I'm just going to write a book that I want to write, and it's going to be terrible, and I want to write about it, and maybe it'll be great, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I don't know. I don't know. That's just such a dumb argument in my mind. Yes, he wrote a book that's supposed to cover some of the greatest and most important topics of all time. The struggle between good and evil, the struggle between, bad and good, the internal struggle of, am I good or am I bad? The worth of souls. I don't know. It's a huge topic and a huge undertaking. And I feel like he did it in a way that, again, added to one of the most familiar stories of all time, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the story of Genesis. He did it in a way that added value to that story. And to be able to do that is incredible, in my opinion. So, whoever wrote that review, you're dumb. Just kidding, but not really. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about John Steinbeck, because there were some things about him specifically that I thought were interesting. Some fun facts that, if you're listening to the podcast, that's, what this is all about. It's about learning things, learning fun facts, little tidbits that you can bring out at your next party and, whip this out. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but learning things is always good, and it's fun to have some fun facts. But Steinbeck was, so he graduated from high school in Central California in the Salinas Valley, again, where most of his books are kind of set in Central California. And he after high school, he went to Stanford to study English literature, and then he just dipped out of there without a degree, which makes him even more of a personal hero to me, because I hate the education system, and I am almost embarrassed that I graduated from college because I have not used that degree one time. And if I use that degree one time before I die, then it will be a failure because I want to be self-employed forever. I want to be an entrepreneur. And so I don't know why I got a degree except for the fact that my mom basically nagged me every day for the 10 years that it took me to graduate from college to finish my degree. And so that's why I have it. But other than that, I'm always impressed with people who make incredible lives and have incredible success without that stupid piece of paper from a college that tells them that they can go on and do great things. He didn't even graduate from Stanford with an English literature degree, and yet he's considered one of the greatest American authors of all time. So if you are out there trying to decide whether or not you should go to college or not, this is your sign. Don't go to college. College is for schmucks, unless you're going into STEM, I guess. Unless you're trying to be a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, then yeah, you probably should go to school. But other than that, I think it's for schmucks. But yeah, so again, I like that about him. Again, he won Pulitzer Prize, he won a Nobel Prize. Oh, he was alive during the Great Depression. And he struggled, just like many Americans during the Great Depression. He actually moved to a house or a cottage or something like that his father owned in Central California. He bought a small boat, and he claimed that he was able to survive through the Depression because he was able to catch fish and crabs, live off the sea, garden his own fresh vegetables. And then he said, with like a little caveat, that's how they survived, except for, sometimes they would steal bacon and local products from the market. I always think that's funny. They're like, yeah, we were able to do this all through fishing and gardening. And then, oh yeah, by the way, we had to steal bacon and other stuff from the store because we were so poor. But again, it's interesting. I mean, this is a part of his life. So this is, again, going back to quite a bit of the inspiration for a lot of his stories. He's written a lot about kind of Depression era Central California. He's written, a lot about poverty. And I think, it's interesting to know that is his background. I mean, he lived, this was, post college. This was after he was married. I think this was with his first wife. I believe he was married 3 times total. And with his first wife, he was essentially, dirt poor, living off of what they could scrounge up from the ocean, what they could garden, and then occasionally even resorting to thievery, which is, that's about as poor as it gets. So interesting. And a little bit more insight into kind of why he writes about what he writes about. Steinbeck was also viewed as a communist. I feel like every episode of my podcast, communism comes up, which is crazy because I felt like when making the list of books for the podcast, I only picked like 4 or 5 books about communism because 1, I'm interested in just understanding it. But 2, I was like, I don't want every week to be a communist-centered book. And now every single book is a communist-centered book. That being said, next week is Pride and Prejudice. I will be hard-pressed to find something about Pride and Prejudice to do with communism. If somebody has any ideas of how I can wiggle communism into the theme of Pride and Prejudice, definitely leave a comment. Let me know how I can do it because I don't know that I'm going to be able to do that. But with East of Eden, it's easy. John Steinbeck was apparently a communist, alleged communist, I guess. He joined the League of American Writers, which was a communist organization in 1935, and he was in support and signed a petition for the U.S. or the Soviet Union to invade Finland and set up their own like pseudo, government or whatever in Finland. And fun fact, he was also called out by George Orwell, kind of the guy of that time for critiquing communism. He was called out by George Orwell, and George Orwell said that John Steinbeck was a communist. So I think that if anybody was to call out a communist, being called out a communist by George Orwell, he probably knows a thing or two. So very interesting. However, there were some documents released by the CIA in 2012, they were unsealed, that indicate that Steinbeck was offered his services to the agency, meaning the CIA, in 1952 while planning a European book tour. And the director of the CIA, Walter Bedell Smith, was eager to take him up on the offer. There are no records of any work that Steinbeck performed for the CIA during the Cold War. However, there were documents that were released by the Secret Service of Ukraine in 2014 that indicate that the Soviet KGB suspected John Steinbeck of being an American agent when he visited the USSR. Interesting. Again, what a life. What a life. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, how do you not write a book at that point? I mean, I guess he's already written plenty of books by this time. That's why he's famous and touring Europe. But seriously, what a crazy, interesting life. I mean, you've got this guy who, I don't know, grew up in Central California, a small farm town, not a lot of farming going on because the farming's not good, but that's what they want to do in Central California is farm. And farming's hard. And then he goes to college to be a writer. He drops out of college. He lives through the Depression by surviving on fish that he catches, eventually becomes one of the greatest writers of all time and becomes a CIA agent. Like, dude, that's freaking awesome. Somebody should make a movie about John Steinbeck's life, not a movie about his books, but about his life. Maybe that's already been done. But you could really lean into this whole CIA stuff, this whole, like, is he a communist? Is he not a communist? George Orwell being like, this dude's a communist. And George Orwell being like, I'm the guy who hates communism. I don't know, that'd make for a pretty good movie, I think. They're not making, I guess they're starting to make better movies, but they struggle making movies. So there's a movie idea for you, Hollywood, if you ever get a hold of this podcast. And then last fun fact about Steinbeck is that he publicly complained about government harassment, which I think is hilarious. So Thomas Steinbeck, the author's eldest son, said that J. Edgar Hoover, who was a president of the United States, but at that time was director of the FBI, could find no basis for prosecuting Steinbeck for being a communist or having any sort of, nefarious, what would you call that? Like, espionage or anything like that. So instead, he used his power to encourage the U.S. IRS system to audit Steinbeck's taxes every single year for his entire life just to annoy him. How terrible is that? I mean, don't get on the FBI's bad side of things. I think that, you could take a look at what's going on with a lot of political people, and you could say, like, yeah, obviously don't get involved with the FBI because that is a club that could be wielded to kind of enforce punitive actions on your political opponents. But apparently this is nothing new. It has been going on since the 50s. And could you imagine getting audited by the IRS every year for your entire life? I mean, how annoying. At that point, you're like, all right, Agent Freddy, coming to my house. Here's this year's receipts. Every year? I think that's kind of funny, honestly. It's annoying, but it definitely, in my opinion, it accomplished its mission to annoy him. So I think that's pretty awesome. So it's just some fun facts about John Steinbeck. Now, I did want to dive into a few specific reviews that I read on Goodreads and kind of debunk them a little bit, and then we can dive into just my final review of the book and move on. So, I want to read this book, this review. This is a 1-star review on Goodreads for East of Eden, and it is, I think Steinbeck is the reason why so many people don't develop a passion for reading. Started reading East of Eden, which is apparently his best work, and all I have to say is woof. I've read a good portion of Steinbeck's works, and I think he is fine for people who have excitement and appreciation for writing. If you just enjoy reading, however, his characters have forced dimensions and are one-sided bores who are either totally good or wholeheartedly evil, making them completely unrelatable. To quote the great Sirius Black, the world isn't split into good people and Death Eaters. Well, this person obviously did not read East of Eden. Did they read a different East of Eden? There's one character in East of Eden that is wholeheartedly evil, and that is Kathy, and she's the spawn of Satan. However, every other book, every other character is complex. Like that is, in essence, the entire purpose of this book. The entire purpose of this book is like based around this idea of Timshel, which, if you've read the book, is, you know, this translated Hebrew word within the story of, I believe, Cain and Abel at this point. It's not, I don't think it's quite, I know that they bounce back and forth between Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve, but I think that this Timshel idea is based around the idea of Cain and Abel. And it's, you know, they're talking about salvation at one point in the book, and they're talking about how it's achieved and whether or not it's guaranteed, whether or not it's earned, or whether or not it's chosen. And this idea of Timshel is that it's chosen, and that individuals are not good or evil, but that you can choose to be good or evil. And that's like the entire purpose of this book. It's like the two boys in this book are, one is kind of inherently good and struggles with that, and he does some not so great things because of it. And then one of the boys is bad and doesn't know why he's bad, but wants to be good and is trying to do good things and doesn't understand. Like, the idea that all of his characters are one-sided is crazy, considering that the entire purpose of this book is to prove the opposite, that both good and evil exists in everybody, and that you have to choose whether or not, like, you get to choose what path you take. I mean, that's, I don't understand this review of the book. Again, I just don't, like, people who are like, yep, this is who it is, obviously didn't take the time to really understand the characters. I do have to say, though, I do agree with this book review a little bit when she says that this book was fine for people who have an excitement and appreciation for writing. Like, if you enjoy beautiful writing, Steinbeck's going to be amazing. But like I said, there are essentially two books within this book. There's the kind of descriptive nature of this book, which is slow and elegant and beautiful. And then there's the story of this book, which is, you know, more or less, you know, like narrative driven or not narrative driven, dialogue based or dialogue driven and very quick. So, and it's just a mixture of these two writing styles. There's, you know, the very slow, beautiful side of things, and there's the very quick dialogue based style of this book. So if you don't enjoy and appreciate writing and you're just looking for a very fast paced story, Steinbeck gives you permission to skip the slower sections of this book. And I would recommend doing that. However, I enjoy those things. I think it's, you know, part of trying to enjoy somebody else's art and trying to also learn to move slower as an individual. I think we're also, you know, like quick dopamine release triggering individuals. Like, we're always just looking for that next hit. Like, come on. And because of that, you know, sometimes we don't take time to enjoy kind of the beauty that's around us. And I think that can be true for this book. So if you're looking for a quick read, something that moves along at a decent clip and kind of fires off and hits dopamine at a regular place, this is not going to be your book for you. That being said, I would recommend that you learn to become somebody who can enjoy things slowly. I think it's an important skill. And I think that it lends itself not to just reading, but to life in general. There are going to be times in your life where you don't get, you know, quick dopamine hits repeatedly, and you're going to have to learn to enjoy kind of the beauty around you, enjoy art, enjoy things slowly. And one of the ways that you can learn to do that is through reading. Learn to enjoy things slowly. So I think that's an important skill. And I do think her distinction is correct. I just think that regardless of whether you are somebody who's like that or not, spend the time to become somebody who doesn't need constant dopamine hits. It'll just save you lots of pain in your life in the future, because life is not about constant dopamine hits. It's about, you know, enjoying the journey. And that is very much evident in Steinbeck's writing. There are two distinctive writing styles. There's, you know, enjoying the journey of Salinas Valley and of the art and of his writing. And then there's the actual story. And I think that's important. There was one other review here that I was going to read, but maybe I'll just read excerpts of it. This other portion is second Steinbeck. I'm just going to read this second part of his book. Actually, I'm just going to read this whole review. Screw it. This is the other review that I wanted to go on. This is another 1-star review. There are valid points in here, but I want to kind of also rip it apart and tell why I don't agree with it. But I understand that this is the review. I understand that I am in the minority, but I was disappointed in this book. I spent the first third assuming that it would get better, the next third praying that it would get better, and by the end, I was just forcing myself to finish it. First, there's absolutely no reason that this book should be as long as it is. The more I read and write myself, I realize what a valuable skill it is to be able to edit yourself. It takes so much more talent as an author to write something that truly resonates with people in a couple hundred pages than it does to pad your book with meaningless anecdotes and attempt to trick your readers into thinking you've penned a great American novel. I am sure others will disagree, but nearly the entire, well, edit yourself, dude. But nearly the entire story of Hamilton family could have been cut without this book losing any of its meaning. I think you need an editor, sir. But I think what you're trying to say is that nearly the entire story of the Hamilton family could have been cut without losing any of its meaning. Just edit it yourself. Second, Steinbeck has managed to come up with, in my opinion, one of the most offensive characters I have ever encountered in literature. Why is Kathy so evil? There is no explanation. She is evil simply for the sake of being evil. If your entire storyline is based around the choice to overcome evil, at least offer an explanation for it. And of course, she has to be a woman because the first person on earth who was tempted into sin was a woman and doomed humanity to suffering and blah, blah, blah. Please. I have a problem with Lee is a character as well. Again, man, edit. His parents were railroad workers and he's uneducated, but he sits around discussing Hebrew translations with his master, who is also uneducated. It just doesn't make sense how all of these characters who went to school through the 8th grade are somehow so enlightened. Anyways, I hate complaining, so I'm going to stop by advising you not to bother with this one. Read a paragraph where Lee is going off about Tim Schull and call it a day. I will admit, the paragraph where Lee goes off about Tim Schull, amazing. That's the highlight of this whole book. But I disagree with a lot of this. So first off, one of the reasons why Steinbeck wrote this book was to show his sons where he grew up. I mean, that's what he says in the book. Like, he wanted to tell a great story against the backdrop of where he grew up. So obviously he's going to want to paint that picture for his sons. So I think a lot of times we think that authors write books, like every book is supposed to be written for me. You know, like this book was written for me, the reader. And maybe this book was written for a different type of reader, or maybe this book wasn't written for you at all, or maybe it was written for the teacher, or maybe it was written for the son or the daughter, or, you know, whoever it is. And to think that, you know, this person needed to edit their book because it wasn't written for me is dumb. You know, this book was written for a specific purpose. Learn the purpose. And then enjoy the book for what it is. Obviously, he has an editor. He won not only a Nobel Prize, or not only a Pulitzer Prize, but a Nobel Prize. So he knows what he's doing, and he is doing it with a purpose. So I would recommend finding out what that purpose is, and then after you know what the purpose is, maybe trying to, you know, maybe point out why he did or did not accomplish that purpose. But in my opinion, he did accomplish his purpose. His purpose wasn't to edit this down into a palatable, you know, retelling of Cain and Abel. What his purpose was is exactly what he states. He was writing the most important story in kind of his magnum opus that is supposed to tell his sons the story of good and evil in across the backdrop of what he calls home. This is going to be a big book. So buckle up. It's going to be a big book. Second, Kathy being pure evil. There are lots of characters in books that are pure evil. Dolores Umbridge, pure evil. I don't know. There are others, I'm sure. I know that I've read other books this year that have had characters that are pure evil. And there's a time and a place for a character that's pure evil. Also, it's not like Steinbeck made her pure evil and then never gave her the opportunity to do good. There were multiple instances in the book when he gave her an opportunity to do good and she chose evil. I think that's also important. He didn't like make this character who was just, you know, evil, no matter what. I mean, he gave her an opportunity to completely start over when she was found on the porch before she was married. She gave her an opportunity to start over when she had kids. She gave her an opportunity to start over when she, you know, met the owner of the brothel. I mean, there were multiple opportunities for her to start over. And I think that it goes to show what happens when a character continuously chooses evil. So, I mean, I don't think that that's bad. You know, and also it's just one character within the book. And I get that you may be offended because it's a woman, but I don't know what to tell you. He had 50-50 choices. Like it could have been a man or a woman. And so it landed on women in this instance, but I'm sure that he's written other books where men have done bad things. I don't understand that argument. Like, do all evil characters in history have to be men? No, and all evil characters in history aren't women. You know, I talked about my two favorite villains prior to this book, and that was Big Brother, man, and Anton Chigurh, man, and, you know, my other probably next favorite is honestly Dolores Umbridge, and that's a woman. And so I feel like, you know, you can have evil women characters. I mean, it's 2024. Women can do whatever they want. They can be evil. And they can also be good, and that's totally fine. All right. And then lastly, Lee as a character was very, I guess, I don't know, conflicting for this individual. Education does not amount to wisdom. And I love that there are classically uneducated characters who are very wise in this book. And then there are also very like classically trained, like very smart characters, like some of the Hamilton family sons who are, you know, gone off to college, very, very smart individuals, but maybe are not as wise as other characters in the book, such as Lee and other members of the Hamilton family. And so I think that's important, especially, again, coming back from the background of Steinbeck, who went to college but never graduated. You know, like he didn't come out with the 4-year degree, and there's got to be a reason for that. And he obviously doesn't value education and that, you know, piece of paper. How many years of school did you go to that directly equates to education? You know, there are significantly educated individuals who are self-educated, who did that through reading, did that through studying, and that are maybe not classically schooled through the education system. And again, I think that comes across from Steinbeck's background. That comes across through the time in which Steinbeck lived. I mean, he lived through the Great Depression. I don't think that there was like an overall emphasis on making sure that you went to a 4-year degree when you're, you know, living day to day by fishing and finding food in your garden. You know what I mean? Like, this is just a different time in history. So to say that, you know, Lee is a very controversial character because he only had an 8th grade education, but by the time he was 40 years old, that he had read enough books to be educated is not accurate. I think I don't know. Like, I don't, again, I don't know. I don't agree with that. I felt like the characters were very well developed. I loved Lee as a character. I loved the Hamilton family. The Hamilton family is one. So the book really follows two families. It follows the Trask family and the Hamilton family, and kind of how they intertwine over the years. The Trask family is definitely the main family, the main characters. They're they follow through with the allegory of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and everything like that. Like it follows their family. However, the Hamilton family play a very significant part within their lives. And that was one of Olivia's critiques about this book. So my wife, when she was reading it, she did say that there were just portions of the book about the Hamiltons that she felt like were not necessary. They didn't really move the story along, and they also maybe distracted a little bit from the Trask family. And if there was any critique about this book, that would be the one that I would give. I would agree with that a little bit. I feel like there could have been a little bit less about the Hamilton family, because there were members of the Hamilton family that got, a large portion or a large description of their life outlined within the book, but then had nothing of value to add to the overall plot moving along in the book. And I don't know the overall purpose of that. Maybe there was a reason why he included that, but I can't seem to figure out what that would be. Maybe it was just to outline more characters' kind of inner struggle with good and evil and their own, because there were characters like the Hamilton daughter who struggled with kind of marriages and failed marriages. And then there was, he had a son who, struggled with relationships with his family. And then you had a son who was very successful financially, but maybe struggled to kind of have a morality compass around business. And, there was definitely an anti-capitalism theme within the book as well that was told through that. So maybe, that's why he included the Hamilton family in there, was to kind of sneak in his kind of left-leaning, communism-leaning ideas into the book through more of an anti-capitalism lens. There are lots of reasons why he may have added the Hamilton family in there, but overall, I felt like I don't think they hurt the story, but I don't think they really helped the story either in a lot of instances. And so if there was any editing that could have happened within the book, it would be, I would take out some of the Hamilton characters. Now, the father, I can't remember his name, the main Hamilton, is one of my favorite characters in the book. So you obviously can't get rid of him, his wife. There are characters that are influential within the book. However, there were just moments where I was like, is this really moving the story along? Maybe not. So that would be my only critique of the book. There may have been some editing that could have been done around the Hamiltons, but other than that, I honestly loved the language in the book. I loved the writing. I loved just how beautiful it was. It was a really fun read. I really, really enjoyed that. So overall, I would give this book a 5 out of 5. I would give it probably a 4.5 out of 5 for enjoyment. It was, again, a little bit long, and I felt like I really had to sit down and focus because of kind of the wordiness and the descriptiveness of things, which I enjoyed, but it also makes it a little bit harder to read. So that's why I would give it a 4.5 out of 5. And then for importance, I would give it a 5 out of 5. I think the overall message in the book, the idea of Tim Schull, the idea of kind of being able to choose good and evil, the play on kind of the story of Genesis. I think just overall, I think that it's an amazing book, and it is considered the magnum opus of one of the most influential American authors of all time. So that being said, I think it is important also to understand, if you'd like to understand literature, I think that it's an important book to read in order to gain an insight into, again, one of America's leading literary figures, the way that I would put it. So I would say 5 out of 5, 4.5 out of 5. Overall comes to a 5 out of 5. Really, really, really enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend it. Definitely take your time though. It is not fast. So just know that going into it, but it's beautiful. It's an amazing book. I really, really enjoyed it. This is a book that originally I think Olivia had ranked a 4 out of 5 on. But then she said that she had to change her ranking to 5 out of 5 purely because she just kept thinking about the book. Like she just kept thinking about the themes, thinking about the characters, thinking about this book and how much she liked it. And she was like, a book that can keep me thinking about it for, weeks after I'm done reading it is a great book. Like that's what made it a 5 for her. And I would agree with that. This is a book that will stick with you. There are themes within this book that will kind of move with you. There are characters in this book that you'll continue to, that you'll remember forever. And that to me makes a very important and very great book. And so definitely would recommend it. So thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Next week's episode is going to be about Pride and Prejudice. Again, like I said, we'll see if we can find any communist themes in Pride and Prejudice. I will do my best. I'll just Google communism and Pride and Prejudice and see if I can come up with anything. Because at this point, I might as well change the name of the podcast to the Bookly Podcast, a review of communism, because I swear every single book has something about that in there. So Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you are still listening at this point, make sure that you leave us a 5-star review. And if you are watching on YouTube, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. And tell your friends about the podcast. It always helps to get a few more listeners and let us know what we can do to make the podcast better for you. Thanks for listening. Bye.